enjoy worship. Wow. Thank you for that blessing. May we pray. Oh God, we ask that you be present with us now and always, and dwell within our hearts and our minds. With your light and Spirit, we ask that you guide our souls, that you'll nurture our thoughts, and you'll create our actions, so we might live out the power of the gospel and show and demonstrate it to others. For we ask it in your Son's name. Amen. 5 minutes. No, that's not how long the sermon's going to be. Shucks, right? 5 minutes. I want you to think about 5 minutes a second. No pun intended. How long are 5 minutes? Well, it might depend on your perspective, I suppose. It's 300 seconds. It's 180 seconds longer than my 120-second brush is, that gives me the smiley face if I spend the whole 120 seconds brushing my teeth. But do you remember the day when an hour felt like a day? Do you remember the time when a day felt like a week? Now an hour feels like a minute, and a day, an hour. And I was warned about that as a young man from family members. They would tell me, when you turn 13, things just get really fast. And then when you get 40 and you blink, you're 60. They were right. They were right. Yeah, I hate it when I've been walking for an hour and I look down on the treadmill and realize it's only been 4 minutes. And what they did not tell me is that what they did tell me that I would lose some memory. And what they didn't tell me was I wouldn't mind so much. One of my mother's favorite sayings was, "Time's a-wasting." Have you ever heard that? Time's a-wasting. And she would say that to me when maybe I hadn't completed a task that she gave me earlier, or I've been dragging through, or on Saturday morning I'm watching Saturday morning cartoons. You know, Bugs Bunny, the Roadrunner, the Coyote, that whole crowd, and I just get mesmerized by that and lock in and not do the things I'm supposed to be doing, and she would shout, "Time is a-wasting," and guess who got motivated? There was a time, however, when wasting time was a blessing. Do you remember that? Anybody here remember wasting time and it being a blessing? Do you remember sitting at the dinner table after Sunday meal and the conversation? We just kind of sat around and talked about stuff. Do you remember sitting out on the porch in rockers in the summer on Sundays and the breeze blowing, just wasting time? And it was such a blessing. Do you remember standing for a half hour after worship service, just talking to friends and relatives at the door before going home? Yeah, wasting time was a blessing. Now, if you're only 5 minutes away from some important completion, it can seem like only a few seconds. You know, if it's 30 minutes or an hour away, and if it's really important, it just seems like it happens instantaneously. If you're waiting for someone, then time seems to slow down. It gets even slower. If you have just 5 minutes to get somewhere, I can imagine what you're doing because I see it all the time. Through the yellow light, through the red light, yes. 5 minutes can be a blessing or it can be very intimidating. Today, the more technology we have, it seems the quicker we have started to move. You know, I come from the generation when email over snail mail was pretty fast, you know, and you were supposed to answer a letter within a week in snail mail. Well, when email came out, then we were supposed to answer within 3 days, or something's wrong, right? And then text message came. Wow. And I understand that if you don't answer text message within a few hours, then people think something's wrong. And then came Instagram. And no matter what you're doing, if you get Instagram, you're supposed to reply immediately. Now, there was a survey that went out not long ago about how long we expect the return of a text message. And the answers were impressive, especially when you broke it down between when you text someone and whether they're at home or at work or at play. And it seems that regardless of what they're doing, 5 minutes is now what you're expecting for a reply in a text message. 5 minutes. And if it's a personal relationship, 2 minutes if it's personal. So folks, if you text someone and they reply back in 10 minutes, it's not personal. Okay. Yeah, we live in a world where we expect to be in contact with one another and get a response to a call quickly. In a world of cell phones and smartwatches and FaceTime, we expect to be able to get a hold of anyone at any time, at any place. And we can get really angry when people ignore us on the Instagram or the text message or in the email. We can get very, very angry. What do you do when you reach out and all you get is silence? Well, what do you do when you reach out to God and all you get is silence? You don't get an answer. Just crickets. Ever been there? Your health is failing. You pray for an answer. Someone dear to you dies, and you ask God why. You see things unraveling, and you pray for an answer to help it. And you don't get an answer. God is silent. It seems that God doesn't have the nerve to face us and give us the answer we completely or fully deserve. And we can get angry. I went to work at an ambulance service at 15 years old. My task was to wash ambulances. And for one reason or another, I ended up doing more than that. And at 16, I became an EMT. And at 17, I became an EMT2. And by 18, I was a paramedic. One of the first ones in South Carolina. I was young. And I saw way too much too soon. Those years burned images of destroyed bodies into my soul. And I saw things that I shouldn't have seen, and I saw images. Any way you can think of a body being destroyed, I probably saw it. Okay. From car wrecks to plane crashes. And the more I saw, the angrier I became. Not at myself so much, not at other people so much, but at God. I became very angry. And my anger was intense. It was hot. Now, my parents sent me to church. They didn't go to church. They sent me to church, and they had this hodgepodge eclectic theology. But part of that eclectic hodgepodge theology was everything was the will of God. If it happened, God wanted it to happen. That was God's plan. Well, if that was true, what I was seeing, somehow God played into that. God was responsible for all that pain and suffering, if that were true. At least, God didn't do anything about it. God didn't stop it from happening. So, I became angrier and angrier through time. And my spiritual back almost broke at one scene. It was an accident scene. And we got there and the car was upside down. It had been hit by a truck and it was upside down, nose down like this. And the door was open and we looked inside and there was no driver. Now this car had been T-boned. There was no driver. And since the door was open, we thought maybe the driver had ran. And I walked away and something just told me to go back. And I went back and I took out my knife and I leaned in and I cut the top of the roof, the liner. And I took my stethoscope and I laid it down on the roof and I could hear the breathing under the car. Well, it took us about 30 minutes to lift the car up so it didn't drag or anything. We were real careful when we lifted up. And bless her heart, the car was actually holding her blood in. It was compressing her. And when we lifted the car, she hemorrhaged. And she died almost instantaneously. And as I was walking away, again, I looked back and I saw this teeny little hand sticking out of the door where the door had crumpled over it like this. And sure enough, it was a child, an 18-month-old little girl in that door. And about 45 minutes later, I was able to get that child out of that door. And I stepped into the ambulance with her in my arms, and I lost her, mouth to mouth, or mouth to nose and mouth. Got back, and we took off for the hospital. She would come back, I'd lose her. She'd come back, and I'd lose her. And we got to the emergency room, and I handed her over to the emergency room physician, the ER doctor. And he went in, and I went to the deck, and I shouldn't tell you this, but I smoked a pipe. And I packed it with Captain Black. And I stood there, and I started smoking my pipe. It's late September, and it's hot, and it's starting to get late afternoon, early evening, and the stars were starting to twinkle just a little bit. And about 30 minutes into the pipe, the attending physician came out and said, I lost her. Folks, I turned around and I leaned over the block wall like this and I just threw up. I could still smell the baby powder and the Similac, the formula, in my nose. And I just threw up. And when the physician walked away, I turned around and put my back against the wall and I looked up into the sky. And I said these words, where the hell are you? Where are you? And I went into this long abyss, angry, agnostic abyss. I didn't say there wasn't a God, but I certainly couldn't tell you there was one either. Well, it seems from our human standpoint that God's silence, his refusal to return our call, makes no sense. So many questions can be cleared up if only God would speak. But all we hear is silence. Why is my life in turmoil? What do you want me to do in my life? What have I done wrong? What can I do better? What can I change? How do I please you? How can I make you happy, Lord? And we get nothing. And we wonder, is God cruel? Does God really care? Is God concerned about us? Well, the credit of writing Psalm 22 has been assigned to David. And if that's true, David wrote 1,000 years before the crucifixion. And if you look at Psalm 22, you see the description of the crucifixion in that psalm, 1,000 years before it happened. And it tells me at least, it may not tell you, but it told me at least, that the cross wasn't an afterthought. It was an intention. David writes some dramatic words. And we see the image clearly The hands and the feet are pierced. The bones are separated. The shoulders are dislocated. There's the beating. There's the robe. And then this cry from David, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why did you turn your back on me? Then, stony silence. No response. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from me? I cry to you day and night, but you do not answer. I can imagine some United Methodist churches and United Methodist pastors after the appointment season shouts those words too. Have you ever been there? Have you ever been at that point? Have you ever had a point in your life when you wonder why God seems to have turned his back on you? Have you ever wanted to hear the voice of the holy and all you heard was crickets, silence? First, I think it tells us that the silence, this passage from David, this song, it tells us that silence does not mean God is really uncaring. Just because we feel forsaken does not mean that we are abandoned. Look at what David says. I don't understand why this is happening or why you didn't answer, but one thing I do know, you are still you. You are still on the throne, and even if you don't answer me, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to trust you. It teaches us that the silence of God not answering us are two different things. Just because you can't hear the voice doesn't mean God's not doing something. At that moment when Jesus takes the sin on his shoulders, all the sin of the world upon him at one time, God turns God's back because he can't look upon all that sin, but God is developing grace at the same time. God's causing the grace to be birthed. We discover here that God has something to teach us in God's silence. It's difficult to have faith when God gives us an explanation of every problem, which holds up to a 5-minute response to every rule, but we would never develop and mature spiritually if there wasn't time of silence. This is why David, by the end of the psalm, says, my response to you will be praised. Now, Gail and I married very young. She just reached down and robbed me right out of the cradle. And her mom and dad owned a large farm, and I loved working on that farm. I loved every minute of it. And they took me in like a son. And matter of fact, I got to use farm equipment that their own son was not allowed to use. That made me feel really good. And I razzed him over it too. Mr. Tyler was a straightforward fellow, and there was no fluff in his conversation at all. And Miss Tyler, Sarah, knew where my buttons were to push. When she wanted me to do something, she knew the button to push to get me to do it. Now, she was 4'0", but she had the swing of Mike Tyson, the spiritual swing of a prize fighter. Now, of course, I didn't go to church. I was that angry agnostic, you remember? And Sarah and Gail, they went to church. I sat at home with a knife and fork in my hand because I was too ill to go to church. You know, it was too hot, too cold, too long, too boring, whatever. Whatever excuse I wanted for that day. My mother had said any excuse is better than none. But by the time they got home, I was ready to go at the dinner table, at the lunch table. Well, before Mother's Day one year, Miss Tyler, I asked Miss Tyler what she would like for Mother's Day. And she said, I'll tell you, but you won't give it to me. And I said, yeah, I will. I'll give it to you. She said, you promise? You see where this is going, don't you? I said, yes, I promise. I want you to go to church. Miss Tyler, no. She said, you promised. Well, this was Mother's Day, that May time. Well, it was fast forward now to the first week of October. And she looked at me and she said, I never thought you'd break your promise. Guess what I did? I got some clothes out of the closet. And I went to church that Sunday with Gail and Miss Tyler. And we came in and we sat down on the third pew. And they had me bookend. Gail was on one shoulder and Sarah was on the other. And I show you what state I was in spiritually. I was trying to figure out how I could get out of here. You know, I looked up and there's communion, like we're going to celebrate in a few minutes. And I thought, oh, my word, of all Sundays, I come to church, and it had to be Communion Sunday. It was World Communion Sunday on top of that, okay? So I thought, well, you know, we'll come out, and they turn right, I'll turn left. And I thought, no, I'll embarrass them. Okay? And I look up here, and I see crackers, and I said, Leon, these people, they have crackers for communion, they call that bread. They have grape juice, and they call it wine. Come on now. And the little pastor, he was a student local minister, he preached one of the worst sermons I ever heard in my life. About half a dozen good stopping points. Sort of like mine, right? What are you laughing at? And the choir, country choir, sang through their nose. You know what I'm talking about? It was the country, whiny, sing through your nose type stuff. And I'm just real cynical now, folks. And we're invited down to the altar rail. And I come down with Sarah and Gail. And I'm right dead center. And Ray Anderson, he's dead now, and I buried him, was the student minister. And he came around, and he said, the body broken for you. The body. He just said this was God incarnate. That this was God on the cross. His body is broken for me. And just as he went by, I heard that voice down deep in my soul. You know, it's your voice, but you know it's so deep it has to be God speaking through that voice. You know what I'm saying? You ever heard that voice? And I heard that voice say, or ask, did you hear that? Did you hear that? And that shook me to the core. And then the little fellow went back and he got the blood. And he got to me and he said, the blood shed for you. Oh. And by the time he got right there, I heard that voice again say, you asked me where I am. This is after 4 years. You asked me where I am. I'm dying and rising with my children every day. And that told me that this God is not some holy other. That this God of the cosmos is an intimate God. That this God may not answer in the words that you and I would like to hear. That God may not speak with a bellowing voice. But sometimes God speaks loudest in the silence. And we have to be able to hear the silence, to hear the voice of God. Nicole Uhr is a British-born essayist. And he wrote these words, we have to earn silence, then work for it. To make it not an absence but a presence, not an emptiness but a repletion. Silence is something more than just a pause. It's that enchanted place where space is cleared, a time is stayed, and the horizon itself expands. In silence, we often say we can hear ourselves think. But what is truer to say is that in silence, we can hear ourselves not think. And so sink below ourselves into a place far deeper than mere thought allows. In silence, we might better say we can hear someone else think. God has great things to say. But if we would hear them, we must be still. If you go back to Eliphaz in the book of Job, when he sees that majesty and that power of God, makes this response: there was silence, and I heard a voice. There was silence, and I heard a voice. In other words, sometimes God's not silent. Oftentimes we are either just too busy, too distracted, too consumed, looking in the wrong places to hear the voice of the holy. It's when we're silent to God that we hear the things that are worth really hearing. So let us just for a moment, before we come and dine at this holy table, pause, close our eyes, tilt our heads, and be silent.